A group of economists is suggesting that if the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations had borrowing powers, they would be better able to respond to situations like COVID. A joint report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the Fraser of Allender Institute and University of Stirling recommends the nations should be able to borrow up to 1% of annual budgets to cover emergencies. Well, David Iser from the Fraser of Allender Institute was involved in the report and joins us now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So tell us why you came to this conclusion.
Well, we looked at the way that the devolved government funding frameworks work at the moment and their limitations. And the most obvious limitation is that the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have very little ability to flex their budgets in response to unforeseen events that occur during the year once they've already set their budgets. They can't borrow. And although they have some limited ability to put money into reserves and draw that down, that's really very, very limited. So when you get a situation like we're seeing at the moment, whereby there is clearly emerging issues around this new COVID variant, what the devolved governments have to do, the only thing they can do really is wait to see what the UK government decides to do in England in relation to business support measures, for example. And it's only when the UK government has announced what it's going to do for England that triggers additional resources for the devolved governments to use to implement their own responses. So we think there's a pretty good case for the devolved governments to have limited ability to borrow and slightly increased ability to draw down from their reserves, so that they're not in this sort of position of having to wait before they can get on with implementing measures themselves.
In terms of the level of funding, though, would 1%, for example, have covered the cost of furlough in Scotland?
No, it certainly wouldn't have done that. We're not suggesting here a sort of fundamental change to the UK constitution. What we did very much is sort of restrict ourselves to looking at modest changes that would nonetheless provide important additional flexibilities for the devolved governments to implement their existing policy competencies. And we think a modest additional level of borrowing and a modest expansion of their existing reserve drawdown powers would provide important flexibilities. But you're right, it's not going to fundamentally change the balance of things that are devolved versus reserved. And the furlough scheme is an example of a scheme that's within reserved competence, and clearly that could only be funded by the devolved governments if they had substantial additional borrowing powers. We don't completely rule that out, but that's a sort of slightly different question.
Well, yes, I was just going to ask that. Why stop at 1%?
Well, we think that what we're suggesting is that 1% in normal times is a really useful additional flexibility, which reduces this delay that the devolved governments face in having to see what the UK government is going to do. But it's not a complete rewrite of the Constitution. There is a really important question. It's a separate question in a way, which is what happens if the virus or some other crisis in future has a disproportionate impact in one part of the UK relative to others. And there you get into that question of, well, under what circumstances should furlough, for example, be made available in one devolved nation but not other parts of the UK? And that's a kind of trickier question. Clearly, the UK government is very reticent about saying that it would fund furlough in Scotland, for example, but not the rest of the UK. It's worried that that would lead to a sort of tendency to go to furlough too quickly if the devolved governments weren't having to bear the costs of that. We suggested a couple of potential options that would be worth looking at. One is if the UK government and devolved governments together agreed a sort of threshold level of infections or hospitalizations above which furlough could be made available in particular geographical areas.
Okay.
That's a bit tricky because it clearly requires some agreement. The alternative is to give the devolved governments substantial additional borrowing powers on a temporary basis so that they could fund furlough in their areas if they felt that was necessary.
David, thank you very much indeed. That's David Iser from the Fraser of Allender Institute.